Okay. So, vamos a comenzar y como dijo Roberto, esta charla va a ser en inglés, así que ahora yo me voy a mover a inglés. Puse en el chat la dirección para que puedan verlo en YouTube con traducción y también está en Facebook Live por si no han podido entrar y si quieren repartirle el link a otras personas. So now we switch to English, and of course it is an honor to have with us in this joint webinar of the MIT Sloan Latin America's Office and the School of Economics and Business of the Universidad de Chile to have Daron Acemoglu. Daron Acemoglu is Institute Professor at MIT and a really, really great economist from who we have learned a lot, and it has encouraged us to think a lot on many issues of macroeconomics and development. Before passing on to Roberto Rigobon's presentation of Daron, I just want to have a couple of administrative details. Please make all your questions in the Q&A box, and please don't do it in the chat because we will be following the Q&A. And also this will be, as I told you, broadcast. The pandemic is really a great tragedy for humanity, but also have allowed us for new things, more democratic access to knowledge and science, and this is an example. It will be broadcast this in Spanish through a YouTube channel and also live Facebook of the university. So all the links are in the chat. So now, Roberto, please, the floor is yours to present our great presenter today.
So it is to me not only a privilege, but it's an extremely highly honored to present Daron. I was a student at MIT when Daron taught his first class. So actually, I have seen Daron's career from the very beginning as a teacher in the economics department all the way to what he has become today. I just want to clarify, Jose said this a little bit too fast. There's when he said that Daron was an institute professor. It's an institute professor. That's the highest honor that we confer to any faculty at MIT. We have had Nobel Prizes that are not institute professors. There are only 12 right now, and Daron is one of them. It's just it's an honor that we, all the faculty from MIT, confer to someone that we feel that is done a contribution to knowledge and humankind that goes beyond the normal, what is expected from MIT. MIT has about 1,000 professors. Daron has been incredibly active and one of the best ones ever. I remember as a student, we used to joke that he knew every single paper published. Now, as a faculty, we continue saying like he knows every single paper ever published. Like, you know, you can ask him about any single topic, and he's incredibly knowledgeable. He's very kind. Thank you so much for doing this. Daron, the region will benefit tremendously from your knowledge and your wisdom. So without further ado, I want to introduce one of the most productive, most smartest individuals that I have ever encountered at MIT. And and I have encountered very smart people, very few actually compared to Daron. So thank you so much for being here, Daron.
Thank you, Roberto. That's a great introduction. Anything I say after that will be downhill, so perhaps I should stop here. So thank you also to Jose, Lee, and Jacqueline for organizing this. It's a great pleasure to be here. And as Jose and Roberto mentioned, I'm going to talk about the current crisis informed by my recent book with Jim Robinson, The Narrow Corridor. This is in Spanish. We are gratified to see that our books are always translated to Spanish before any other language. So the Spanish edition came out, I think, a few weeks or a couple of weeks after the English edition. And the reason why I'm going to use the book is not as a way of summarizing the argument of the book, But in the next half hour, so that we have enough time for the Q&A, I want to offer a perspective on this beast. I think it would not be an overstatement to say that our world has been thrown upside down, and not only because of the huge number of deaths and the incredible damage to the economies around the world, but because the COVID-19 crisis has raised serious questions about our institutions. Is this the end of democracy in many parts of the world, not least in Latin America? Liberty, globalization, economic integration? And such questions cannot be tackled but with a conceptual framework. And I want to offer a conceptual framework from our book to do that. It's of course for you to judge and debate in the time that remains whether that's the right conceptual framework. But here it is. It's very simple, simplified. We try to do to develop something that helps us talk about 2,500 years of human history, and obviously it's simplified in many ways. But let me summarize it. We reduce everything to two variables. On the horizontal axis represented is power of society, in particular the ability of non-elites to solve their collective action problems, engage in politics through institutional or non-institutional means, throughout much of history through non-institutional means, and hold their own. On the vertical axis, the power of the state and often the elites that control the state. So it's an explicitly political story. The arrows are meant to summarize the typical evolution of different types of society. So one thing that immediately jumps out at you from this framework, therefore, as shown by the arrows, is that there is no tendency in our telling of all countries to naturally lead to a unique type of economic, political, or social system. There are at least three types of stable social arrangements, which we call absent or weak Leviathan, despotic Leviathan, or in the middle there, you see what we call the shackled Leviathan. These are persistent, self-reproducing, and quite distinct systems. What do we mean by the arrows, for example, in the despotic Leviathan one, which we argue in the book is best exemplified by China, to which I will return briefly later. What you can see with the arrows is that ultimately you're leading to a higher level of the power of the state, but lower level of power of society. It's an unequal contest, so to speak. The state becomes so strong in its ability to shape society and to impose its will on society, not necessarily through just violent repressive means, but generally its ability to control society, that social action by non-elites to block what the state is doing, to change the direction of what the elite are trying to do, is very, very limited and gets more limited over time. So in this telling, China is not something in its current ability to have a very well organized communist party that is completely dominant over society. That's not something that emerges because of Xi Jinping. It's a history of 2,000 years. That's what those arrows are summarizing. At the bottom quarter, you have the arrows going in the opposite direction. This is best exemplified in our telling by stateless, what anthropologists call stateless or small-scale societies, where state institutions are very weak or non-existent. There may be chiefs, but chiefs don't have much authority. And there are many non-institutionalized, but very well-scripted traditions and political ways of participation of people in public decision-making. The reason why these societies tend to a different type of long-run outcome is because once you have this configuration, there is an endemic belief in society, not unjustified, that you want to limit political hierarchy, because if somebody is able to increase their authority, economic or political power, they're going to start bossing other people around, and they are very much averse to this type of political hierarchy. So now, the problem with both of these configurations is that they don't correspond to the types of states that we have become accustomed to in parts of the world, nor do they simultaneously engender sort of people being politically free, socially free, and states sort of participating in that process by providing means and opportunities to people. So that happens in this narrow corridor, giving the name to the book. It happens when there is a balance between state and society. But the more telling part of this is that the nature of the dynamics is very different within that corridor that is traced here. So instead of one party dominating the other, you see these arrows going to higher and higher levels of the power or the capacity of the state and society. That's what we call in the book the Red Queen effect. Both state and society are simultaneously running, and they're trying to outrun each other. But in that process, they are also cooperating, and they're bringing much greater levels of capacities of the state, but bolstered by both cooperation, involvement by the society, and control by society. So that's the sense in which, in contrast to Thomas Hobbes's view of the Leviathan, this is a very different beast. It's a shackled Leviathan. Many societies throughout history have entered the corridor, but it's a hard thing to enter the corridor because it's narrow, and it's a hard thing to stay in the corridor. Now, I want to spend the next 3 slides giving you a little bit more context, what it takes to be in the corridor, and what are the difficulties to be in the, what are some fundamental social impediments to being in the corridor. I'm going to do that in the form of snippets because I think it's more interesting and also perhaps more memorable. So this is a broken piece of pottery from ancient Greece, and it has the name of Themistocles. Themistocles was the closest thing that Greeks had to a hero, even more than Pericles. He single-handedly argued for the building of a navy, and then commanded the navy against the Persians, saving Athens, saving Greece, and later correctly identified Sparta as a big threat and argued for years for getting prepared for defending Athens against Sparta. So you would think that this is therefore from a monument that the Athenians had built to honor Themistocles. And perhaps they saw him as a bulwark of one of the first democracies, in fact, one of the first examples of this sort of strong state and society. Actually, no, unfortunately not so for Themistocles. This is from Themistocles' ostracism. Under Cleisthenes, about 500 years before BC, Athenians passed a law, which is very similar to many other laws and norms that they had developed, which they called the ostracism law. Every year, the constituents, the assembly, would vote whether there would be an ostracism. And this assembly was very democratic by the standards of the time. All males could vote, or citizens, unfortunately not women. And if there was an ostracism, then again, all citizens would write the name of somebody on a piece of broken shard called ostrakon, hence the name ostracism in Greek. And whoever had their name written most would be ostracized from the city, exiled from the city for 10 years. This was one of the many methods that the Athenians had for checking people who were getting too big for their boots. The whole Athenian democracy was built around safeguards after safeguards, many of them norms, not just institutions, that made sure that no powerful person could hijack democracy. That's how they thought of being in the corridor, or they wouldn't use the word corridor, but their idea was, sure, the state needs this capacity, but then we have to make sure that everybody involved with the state is controlled very tightly. And that, I will argue, is the essence of the shackled Leviathan. But it's a very difficult thing to achieve. And this is one one of the facets of it, which I think is actually quite deep. This is what we call the cage of norms in the book. This gentleman is one of probably several million manual scavengers in India, according to the estimates of the Human Rights Watch. They do the most menial, most demeaning jobs, cleaning animal and human excrements under the most unsanitary conditions. It's just a terrible, absolutely horrible job. Why do they do it, and who does it? Well, it turns out that almost all of them are from the 200 million Dalits, or the untouchables, the very low rank of the Indian caste system. And they say they are doing it because they feel compelled. Now, you might think this is just another example of a minority, just like African Americans in the United States or indigenous populations in Latin America, being discriminated against by law, institutions against them. Well, it's actually more complex. Because if you look at the Indian Constitution, it is an uplifting, amazing document, partly because it was engineered by a man named Ambedkar, who was a Dalit himself. He knew what he spoke of. He fought against Gandhi and Nehru very much, who were from the Brahmin, the highest caste, and they didn't really think that the caste system had to be brought down, or not so quickly anyway. But Ambedkar really had his intellectual fingerprints on the Indian Constitution, and the Indian Constitution bans all sorts of caste-based discrimination. In fact, introduces, positive affirmative action. But of course, the norm-based discrimination, the hierarchies that are created in society, are much more deep-rooted than that. 80 years after that constitution, or 70 years after that constitution, and still, caste-based discrimination is every part of Indian society. Well, that really makes being in the corridor really hard, because A, it creates divisions within society, make it much harder for the society to check the Leviathan. But second, also, once you have this social inequality that's ingrained in society, it becomes very difficult for then society to stand up to the elites and compete and contest power against the elite. Well, that is a problem in Latin America as well. So since I'm going to talk about global context, but I'll bring it to the Latin American context as well. These are the casta paintings from the colonial times. They are not as scripted as the Indian caste system, but it is a caste system nonetheless. And its effects perhaps are not as visible as in the Indian system, but they are still deep-rooted and not erased. If you look at inequality, Latin America economically is one of the most unequal continents. For example, this is the total share of the top 1% in Latin America. That's at the same level as Middle Eastern kingdoms and the United States and Russia for much of Latin America, including Brazil and Chile, but not just confined to them. But even more importantly, social status may be very unequal in Latin America. I was, for example, intrigued by these data, which showed the background of Piñera's government in mid 2000s, which is that the social background of almost all of the cabinet members and the business elite in Chile are actually very, very similar, from a handful of private schools that are much more elite than the background of most workers in society. So I will argue that all of this really makes it very difficult and even more challenging, or using the language from the book, makes the corridor even narrower. So why is this relevant? Well, part of the reason why it's relevant is because even before the COVID-19 crisis struck, we were living through a very discombobulating period. Automation, globalization, integration have all created forces towards greater economic inequality. And whether you can combat greater economic inequality and turn that into a self-correcting process, I think very much depends on the political system and social inequality. And those were problems we were grappling with. And all of these fault lines, I think, have become much deeper because a huge shock has struck. There's no doubt in my mind that this is a perfect specimen of what Jim Robinson and I called in our previous book, Why Nations Fail, a critical juncture, something that makes the inadequacy of the current institutions completely apparent and significantly increases the likelihood of an institutional change, a radical institutional change. But in what direction you're going to go is going to be very different from society to society, even within Latin America. So therefore, I want to use the next 5 minutes talking a little bit about what does this framework say about when you hit it with a shock, what happens? And then I will conclude in the remaining 5 minutes. Well, the way that political scientists think about many of these topics is shaped by what they call structural factors. Structural factors determine differences across society. And those differences then beget different types of political and social superstructures. For example, something like the Black Death that killed 30% of the population in Europe and parts of Asia, or huge wars, are structural factors. So is whether you grow sugar or wheat, whether you have oil or diamond. So these are undoubtedly important. For example, one of the most important ideas in political science when it comes to questions about what makes these states high capacity is the one by political sociologist Charles Tilly, summarized by his statement, "States made war and war made the state." The idea is that if you need to fight wars, you need to build better state bureaucracy. You need to have taxation power in the hand of the state so that you can finance wars. Well, our framework says, well, that's only part of the story. Why? Well, let's take the same picture, but put a change in the environment. And I'm going to do that in the simplest possible way. And I'm going to think of the environment changes. For example, there is a threat of war or a COVID-19 crisis that requires the power of the state to be increased. And look at that starting from different parts of this state space. RO1, what I've labeled, is Switzerland. So if you look at Swiss history, the threat of war, especially from the Habsburgs, brought these pretty lawless, feuding, small society, mountainous cantons together into a confederacy. They said, we have to build a war, we have to pass new laws. And in the process, they also completely changed law and order in society, put an end to feuding. So that's like you're outside of the corridor and the impetus gets you into the corridor. And then once you get into the corridor, you travel, if you're lucky, along this upper trajectory. But actually, take the case of Prussia, which arguably had some of the most developed parliamentary systems in the 16th and 17th centuries. Ancient rights that put a lot of constraints on what governments could do. But then the 30 Years' War and an ambitious monarch, Frederick William I, said, I'm going to build an army. And to do that, he sidelined the parliament. He increased the power, taxation power. He grabbed a lot of land. He passed a huge conscription, conscripting perhaps half of the population, male population, set up a huge requisitioning system. And, in our framework, that would be, you go out of the corridor. After these changes, Voltaire quipped, other countries have states, other states have armies. In Prussia, the army has a state for itself. So, therefore, really, what we make of many of the current challenges really isn't a deterministic picture, like if you have certain types of challenges, you do this. If you have certain types of environments, you do that. It really depends about where we are and how we use those opportunities. And I want to now use my next 5 minutes to end the talk talking about the twin challenges that we are facing: new technologies and COVID-19. And I think those two are inseparable. Part of the reason why they are inseparable is because new technologies had already affected every aspect of our lives. Inequality, has many causes, but that is one of the technological change has been one of the drivers of it over the last 30 years, and that's one of the main reasons why institutions in much of the West, including Latin America, were under new strain. But also technologies have empowered states to be much more capable in controlling society. Exhibit one in that would be those artificial intelligence cameras in Tiananmen Square, or the social credit system in China, which using AI can keep track of the activities of over 1 billion people and then decide what types of goods, services, and rewards they are going to receive. These are all before the COVID. And then during the COVID, all of this infrastructure has been used, in many cases successfully within China, to actually control, trace, isolate people who are infected. One of the reasons why there is a partial success of the Chinese system. Now, I think the lessons that many are learning, perhaps incorrectly, I will argue incorrectly, from the current crisis is that, well, there are drawbacks to these cameras and to this sort of social control, but they're also creating a much greater benefits compared to democratic failures that we're experiencing in the US, Brazil, the UK, and so on. Well, does that mean that the future is going to be more like China? Or if we don't like a more China-like system, does it mean that we have to say, well, we don't want this, therefore we really need to tie the hands of the Leviathan as much as we can? So for example, having more tax revenues, more redistribution, more regulation of technological change, globalization, or perhaps even social regulations, which have become so important in the context of COVID-19, are a no-no. Actually, these debates have precedence in history, and revisiting them is the best way of ending this talk, I would say. And one place where you see that is during a previous episode where the political, economic, and social system that had prevailed in much of the Western world came under attack with the Great Depression that led to untold poverty and economic disruption, huge unemployment, huge uncertainty, huge political backlash, and then World War II, which just exacerbated all of these things. Many learned the lesson from this, that we needed more government intervention. For example, the emblematic Beveridge report in 1942, in the middle of the bombing of London in the UK, led by Lord Beveridge, was a turning point, or at least a symbolic turning point, because it called for what we then today associate with the classic welfare state: minimum wage, national health insurance, social security, aid for poor families with children, sick leave, redistributive taxation, and so on and so forth. It was one of the changes, one of the events that occurred that some argue really energized the British public. And in fact, that's the reason why right after the war, they kicked out Winston Churchill despite his success during the war, because they wanted a Labour government to implement the Beveridge plan. But not everybody was happy. An emigre from Nazism, Friedrich von Hayek, who was at the time teaching in my alma mater, London School of Economics, saw this as a new totalitarianism. He said, well, if you give the state so much power, that would be the end of liberty. This means, among other things, that even a strong tradition of liberty is no safeguard, because that liberty will be eroded. So in other words, in the context of what I'm saying, what Hayek was saying is exactly, look, you are here, but you strengthen the state and you're going to go out of here. But it turned out that Hayek turned out to be wrong. Why did it turn out to be wrong? Well, the reason why it turned out to be wrong is exactly related to the nature of behavior in the corridor. When you increase the power of the state, the only path is not to go out. You can also go this way if the power of society increases commensurately. Or put differently, the only choice is not between make the state completely pro-state so that it is powerless, but you can also make the state powerful if society can be as powerful, as strong because of its ability to stand up to politicians, to challenge them, to contest power through institutional and sometimes street means. But of course, that requires the same type of attitude that the ancient Greeks had, and certainly not the one that the Indian caste system or the Latin American casta system engenders. You really need the citizens to feel like citizens, they're the equals, and the politicians and the elites are their servants, not their masters. So that is really, perhaps miraculously, because the corridor is narrow, what much of the world achieved via the social welfare state. If you look at Europe and the US, despite its more half-hearted way in which it went there, the 4 decades that followed World War II were their golden age. Productivity growth, economic growth, stability, and equality have never been achieved to that extent that we have experienced during that 4 decades. So therefore, I believe that despite the more fractured, polarized, and poisoned environment we live in, the corridor hasn't disappeared. Perhaps it has narrowed. Perhaps people like Trump and Bolsonaro make it much harder, but it hasn't disappeared. Today, we need these new responsibilities perhaps even more than in the 1940s and the 1950s. But the task ahead is really quite spectacular, because with these new responsibilities, we are entering a new phase, and the way in which the society has to be very different and very powerful is going to be quite distinct when we have social media, we have a much more globalized information structure, we have much greater inequalities, and the number of billionaires is much, much greater than any time in history. So what that implies for the future, as the designation of critical juncture I emphasized at the beginning, is really hard to say. But one thing I know is that we owe it to ourselves to try, because be it in Latin America, be it in the West, to give up and say we will have to settle either for China or for a powerless state, I think is not an appetizing future. So we have no choice but try. Let me stop here and take questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Darren.
Thank you, Darren.
Let me just start, because I was, I think that the first question, and there is an underlying in your discussion and in your framework, there is an underlying a trend of higher progress and well-being of the people within the narrow corridor. So, but there could be cases in which you could say, well, okay, China, but China perhaps is the only way this excess power of the state in order to build a society that then should move to the narrow corridor. So there is this whole discussion of autocratic regimes as a necessary condition for them to have progress. We could even move this discussion to Chile's dictatorship, you know, and so there is a, how do you see that view of this kind of whether countries like China will move to the narrow corridor, and that's the strategy that they are following will lead them to the narrow corridor?
Well, thank you very much, Jose. I think there are several questions here. I don't want to take too long in answering the first question so that we can have more, but I will take a few minutes to answer this because I think it's very important. First, you know, there is no presumption here that economic growth only happens in the narrow corridor. In fact, we emphasize a lot in the book that there is economic growth and public goods provision that is crucial for economic growth under the despotic Leviathan. So in that sense, China is not exceptional. We've had hundreds of years of despotic economic growth. Their nature is different. They're much more top-down, some, you know, with few exceptions, not as much based on innovations and not as participatory. And that creates some types of instabilities, but they're not instabilities that are going to show up themselves in 1 or 2 or 3, 4 years. And in fact, the biggest way in which you can see is when you compare the despotic Leviathan to the absent Leviathan. It's always, and this is why many social scientists, like following Samuel Huntington and that sort of school, say, oh, strong states are better, because they compare the despotic Leviathan to places where the states are failing, and they say, oh, so much better to have a strong state. But really, this is just one way of achieving economic growth, and there is a different, and I would argue, better way of achieving economic growth. Does the evidence back this claim up? Well, you know, history is complex. But one period in which we can look at the date, we can look at that, is exactly during the post-war era from 1960 to 2012. We don't have the data, we haven't updated it. The last 7 years have not been great for democracies. But you know, in some of my work with Pascual Restrepo, Suresh Naidu, and Jim Robinson, what we've shown is that democracies are much better at growing, quite significant. And contrary to the sort of the Chilean myth, if you want, democracies are also much better at reforming institutions. So it is true that the Chilean context, being very special because it was sort of a democratic, quasi-democratic socialist government being brought down by a very free market infused dictatorship, did some reforms. But the bulk of the evidence is that, you know, authoritarian governments do fewer reforms. And then part of the reason is because they like the monopolies and they protect the monopolies that go to their cronies. So again, the future may be different. We're in a new world, as I've mentioned, but I wouldn't be so quick in ruling out democracies. And I think the Chinese response to the coronavirus really shows both the light, the good and the bad sides. You know, the early things where the virus spread in the population and internationally because information was suppressed. Later on, massaging of the statistics show the dark side, but this high state capacity being used for controlling things, especially when unencumbered with privacy concerns, also shows how you can deal with emergencies. So I think it's a complex picture, but I wouldn't rule out democracies.
Yeah. So talking a little bit about the power of society, let me just do a plug that MIT and ITBA are starting the 100K entrepreneurship competition today. So we're talking a lot about the power of the state. So I want to highlight the fact that also entrepreneurship is happening in the region. So please, if you're interested in participating there, go to the 100K that is starting today. I wanted to ask a question that I found in Spanish, so let me translate, that I thought was very interesting in the Q&A, Daron. Again, thank you so much for this chat. He's asking, does taxing the rich will be a way to get into the corridor?
That's a great question.
Yeah, and they put it with and just in the translation, they mention it with the wealth tax. Would the wealth tax help to move it to the...
So will the wealth tax will move it? That's interesting. But given the current state.
Right. I don't know. So here is what I know, and I'll argue the subtlety here. First of all, I have argued, and with empirical as well as conceptual grounds, that in the US and to a large extent in Western Europe, we tax capital too little. And that creates a lot of problems, both in terms of excessive automation, low wages, not as much employment in the formal sector. The data I know from Latin America is that it's doubly true in Latin America, but I have not done the detailed sort of decompositions that I have done in the US, for example. So both for political economy and pure economic efficiency reasons, capital income taxes have to be increased. That's different from wealth taxes. For example, that corresponds mostly to a broader tax base, corporate income taxes, etc. Now, what happens if you have capital income taxes for 40 years? Do you sort of start reducing the return to capital to some degree, but still encourage a lot of risk taking and so on and so forth, because people are still benefiting from the risk that they take as capital owners or entrepreneurs. Now, the question is, if you pass that, because it's a flow thing, it will impact the very rich, but it won't get rid of Jeff Bezos and Carlos Slim's wealth right away. Now, then the question is, what are the things that you are getting in addition by directly affecting Carlos Slim, directly affecting Jeff Bezos? And I think there are some good and bad, and you have to balance them out. On the good side, if those people are using their wealth as a political tool to build further political power and wealth, as some of those are clearly doing, then wealth taxes are a way of helping the political economy. On the other hand, if wealth taxes appear as punitive and increase political polarization and conflict within society, and if they appear as repudiation of existing property rights arrangements, then they will further poison the political environment. So I think it is a difficult sort of decision, and it has to be decided case by case. But I would add that if we go back to what we had in many countries in the 1960s, which are robust inheritance taxes, corporate income taxes on firms, plus progressive taxation, you actually achieve most of that without changing the social contract and appearing to introduce punitive taxes, but in some cases perhaps more is necessary.
Thank you very much. Quite interesting. There's another concern, and it was part also of your discussion, and this other concern is about how do you see that globalization may go after the virus or with this crisis. And also in your book, you talk a lot about globalization that can make it narrower or it can widen the corridor. So I think that is connected to where globalization is going, whether the future is for a globalization enhancing the corridor.
So thank you for that question, Jose, or thank you whoever asked it. Those are great questions. In the book, indeed, we discuss a lot about when globalization can make the corridor narrower or broader. I would love to talk about that, but for shortness of time, let me not repeat that. But let me talk about what are the strains that we are creating for globalization right now. And I think so that I can allow time for more questions. So I think the world was already going through a deglobalization process even before the crisis. And it's not just because of Trump. And part of the reason for that is because globalization does create a lot of pressures. Whether it makes the corridor narrower or broader, that's true. And the way in which we've gone about globalization, I think, has had some real failings. In particular, when we, at least within my circle, people who think about institutions, it is almost axiomatic that you need institutions domestically, like laws, regulations, sets of norms that really constrain behavior, what firms can do, what organizations can do. But we've gone for a globalization system that's completely devoid of these rules. International organizations are extremely powerless. And we have also gone for a globalization that's perhaps too efficiency focused without any kind of resilience. So if you look at how firms build their supply chain, I get a 5% cost saving, I'll build my supply chain. But what if my supply chain collapses? And it's not only during the pandemic, during other periods, the Great Recession, the Japanese tsunami, we've gone through all of these same things. So I think all of these require some kind of rethink. But in my mind, I think it's really impossible to have healthy globalization without stronger institutions bolstering it. Whether it's the United Nations, whether it's the World Bank, whether it's the WHO, perhaps it's something new. But without those institutions, I think globalization will always create much more risk and discontent than it needs to.
Building on this, you have been very vocal about the debt and how we're going to handle the debt due to COVID for emerging markets. Could you elaborate a little bit on what you have been?
Well, it's a little bit like my wealth tax idea, right? So what was the wealth tax idea? Which is that if you have made your money, if you've made your money being an entrepreneur, you misused it, and there are better ways of fixing the current market failures and the political failures, then I don't see much justification for me to come and say, Roberto, I've decided I'm going to take your wealth away. But if on the other hand, if you've made your money through illicit means and you are misusing your money, that's a different matter. Now, I would say that over the last 30 years, we have had both types of money making in financial institutions. We've had great innovations in banking. We've had important financial intermediation when money was needed, but we've also have had that the financial system has helped kleptocrats and thieves shelter their money in tax havens. They have lent to autocrats and helped them clean out their countries. So I think it's a case-based case thing, whether those are really what used to be called at some point odious debts, that debts that countries have accumulated but their citizens haven't benefited, and they were done clearly by non-representative government. If I elect you and then you act as my agent and you make mistakes, then that doesn't give me a justification for saying, well, I don't want to bear Roberto's debts. But if you're a dictator, if you came to power by force, or if you've kept power through illicit means, and then you've accumulated this debt in this day where I think all of these countries are under such huge strains, that especially because of their public health systems, and it's going to get much worse. I think make no mistake about that. We're not at the end of this crisis. I think the international system all working towards upholding the rights of all of these financial institutions, I think, is a weak one.
Yeah, my country is an example of that disaster.
Venezuela is one that I had in mind. Yes.
You just mentioned it, and I fully agree with you. I think that there is a need, a part of the need that the world in this globalization, or for good globalization, has to be also with multilateralism and institutions that can set rules, and we have some form. Of course, there won't be a full world government, but at least the rules is quite important. Now,
yes, thank you. Yeah, that's very important, Jose. That's absolutely important. I mean, I just wanted to say, I forgot to say that multilateralism. I think, if when we talk about these supranational institutions, if they are U.S. institutions and they are appearing to look after U.S. interests, I think that won't work. They really need to be a global element to them. Absolutely. Yes.
Well, but that was kind of then the question and what you mentioned, the dangers of inequality, polarization, and also the tendencies of Trump government, whether there is a risk for US of leaving the narrow corridor.
Absolutely. Couple of things. It's easy for Americans to criticize Latin America because Latin America's political failures have been severe. But first of all, US, though we place it in the corridor, we emphasize in the book that has always had an uneasy existence in the corridor. I can talk more about the details of that, but let me not get into that in the interest of time. But add that we live in a period where the risks of the US institutions collapsing has never been higher than now. Yeah. I think it is absolutely not a freak event, unlikely possibility, but something that's quite possible. And that's because we've had the perfect storm. The weaknesses of US institutions that go back to 250 years, weak federal state, especially in its ability to provide public services, fight poverty, stop discrimination, has come together with much greater inequality and much greater social tensions that have reduced trust in institutions. And then on top of it, you have, an authoritarian populace with the worst tendencies, bolstered by a party that has ceased to pay any attention to the longevity of the republic. So this combination, not every event that looks like this has led to terrible things, but this is the combination that you have in 1920s in Italy, in the late 1920s and early 1930s in the Weimar Germany. So it is a cocktail waiting to explode.
Let me ask something more related about Latin America. What about countries that are weak on the state and weak on the society? Do we have it better?
The super weak.
Like the super weak. Like
actually, this is a great question, Roberto. Thank you for asking me. And I would not want to do that, but I'm going to do it. I'm going to share my screen again. And the reason I'm going to share my screen again is precisely because this is really an important question for Latin America. This is what we call in the book paper leviathans. These are societies that really look to have the worst of all worlds. Colombia, Central America, to some degree Venezuela before it really went into its current crisis, where it's certainly not a strong society, especially indigenous groups completely powerless, democratic institutions only weakly institutionalized, but also states very weak. Now, this would appear to be the worst of all possible worlds, and in some ways, for people who live under those, it is. You get no public services, and both the state and the guerrillas kill you in Colombia. But on the other hand, it also provides unique ways of entering the corridor. And that's what I show in this picture, which is what we call path 3. So, if you are here, the only way you can enter into the corridor, if you're in like a China-like situation or Turkey, is by society to get stronger. That seems simple, but it's actually very hard because there's a strong resistance to it. If you are here, the way you get into the corridor is that it at first looks harder. You have to strengthen both society and state. But that itself has a self-reinforcing logic. And it opens new possibilities, that people come with a new social compact and they promise to build the state while at the same time keeping the shackles on it. We don't have great national examples for it that are easy, but there are several local examples, like for example in Bogota or in Lagos in Nigeria, that we go through in the book, that really traced what we call this path 3. So I think there are opportunities, and look, like if you look at some governments in Latin America, like Uruguay, that have really been so quick at building state institutions and building legitimacy, that really says that, those sorts of dynamics that double down both on state and society perhaps are not impossible.
One question that was sent to me by chat by one of our main scientists on climate change. Maisa Rojas just sent me a question. What is the role of climate change in navigating the ins and outs of the corridor?
Great question. Unfortunately, we punt on that. I have done other work on climate change, and I do agree, I do believe very, very firmly that it is an existential crisis for us, for the world, that needs urgent action. We don't talk about it in the book, and I won't talk about it here for the very simple, I can talk about it, but not in the context of the framework, because it really requires supranational global efforts. And this framework is really about national government. So we really need to broaden that and start thinking about the politics of global institutions. And as I pointed out, unfortunately, they are very weak and non-existent. And I think that's part of the reason why response to climate change has been very difficult. Generally, so we have seen the COVID-19 also explains why it's also very difficult, because science-based policy is very challenging at the best of times, and climate change really requires that and much greater level of global coordination than the response to COVID-19. So I completely agree that we have to pay much more attention to it. I think we all have a responsibility in keeping that in the agenda, because every day we lose is a day we cannot afford to lose. But I won't say that the corridor immediately solves that problem.
You could argue that a global crisis could weaken international institutions, and
it is certainly weakening international.
Yeah, so in some sense, it's just.
And because, I mean, you know, part of the reason that this is a global crisis, and the international institutions themselves haven't, you know, of course, I would never ever agree with anything that President Donald Trump does, but even without agreeing with him, it's not a far-fetched thing to say that WHO has been a disaster.
Yeah, well, yeah. So yes, it has been. Yeah. I want to, okay, Jose, last question. I want to be cognizant of Daron's time.
No. Yes, because this is a very Latin, and a lot of Chileans are asking now. Of course, there is this tension in Latin America and in Chile and everywhere between autocratic populist state, you know, and this may happen left and right, you know, with AMLO in Mexico, Bolsonaro in Brazil, and liberal democracy. And how do you see this tension in Latin America? And of course, a sequel to that question is about all Chileans asking, where do you think Chile is going after the social disruption and the social crisis of last year that you also witnessed?
So, I mean, I think AMLO is not the solution. I think any leader who tries to weaken institutions, which AMLO is not the solution. But I actually see the future of Latin America not as a bleak one, because starting from this high level of social inequality and lack of effective democratic participation, you see much greater levels of democratic participation in various different parts of Latin America. You know, I think in Mexico, you know, what brought AMLO to power was an anti-elite feeling, which I think is an important part of the step. In Chile, you know, which is, you know, despite its huge success, is a very unequal country, both socially and economically. I think the recent protests are really an articulation, and at some level, a strengthening of those feelings. In Argentina, you know, same thing. You know, I would not defend anything the Peronists do, but obviously there is the part of the support for Peronism comes from, you know, the less organized parts of society wanting to have more voice in the political sphere. So I think all of those are healthy developments for Latin America, and in the best of times, these would not have been easy processes to translate into an institutionalized form of government that is not beholden to, you know, a small group of elites, but at the same time still strengthens institutions rather than break them. Now, in the context of COVID-19, that is going to become harder, if anything. But again, I think the impulse for greater democracy, for greater sort of a better playing field that you saw in Chile starting in October or September, I think that's going to continue, and I think that's an important element of the future of Latin America.
In other words, the bigger participation together with a leader that can form that vision, that increases the powers of both,
who can form that vision in order to build the institutions.
In order to build both institutions.
My view is that you don't want to trust the leaders at all, but leaders are important because they are an intermediate step to building the institutions. And that's why, you know, for example, AMLO is wasting those opportunities, because he's actually using that, you know, great power that has been vested in him to destroy the institutions, not build them.
Yeah, I know, and perhaps one could say that Latin America is a juncture in which progress, but the need of social inclusion put at a crossroad.
Absolutely.
That could be a good future, but that could also returning back to the tradition of populism, high inflation, and lack of economic progress. So, yeah, it's.
I want to thank Daron for his time. His commitment to the region has been spectacular. Thank you so much for being with us. It's very important for the Universidad de Chile and MIT and the Latin American office there to have speakers of your incredible depth and knowledge and impact. Thank you so much for this hour. It has been an extremely important moment for all of us. So, and I think that we're going to learn from here. I hope that more people read your book, because clearly there's we can see our histories there, and we can all put Latin American countries all down in the origin we're on it. So, I mean, so in fact, for Latin America, you don't need a corridor, you just need the axis. So either anarchy or so, but so it was a little bit depressing that, but I think that we can learn a lot from the experience of others. So hopefully we can find that corridor. Thank you so much for being
thank
here.
you. It was great. It's my pleasure to have been able to join you guys. Thank you, Jacqueline, Jose, Roberto, and Lee. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much,
Thank
Darren.
you,
It was a
Thank
pleasure
you, Jacqueline and Lee, for
discuss
doing
with
this.
you.
And
I'm
again,
certain people is quite happy.
Yes, and I remind everybody that the 100K entrepreneurship competition is starting today. So at 5 p.m.
Okay.
Argentina time. Thank you, Darren. Thank you,
Thank
everybody.
you very much, Darren. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.